been a really fantastic gathering for us today. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is the chairman of the party, Mr. Jim Lewthwaite.
Right, I've been saying for some considerable time that 2025 is going to be a year of change, and that was long before Trump confronted Zelensky the other day, that a sea change is taking place right across the Western world, in which the old politics, which have been in force since the 60s, the gradual shift to the left towards so-called liberalism, which is actually very authoritarian, it isn't liberal at all. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and co would simply not recognise it. But lefty liberalism has been a dominant force now for 60 years, and those people who are stupid enough to believe that history is linear and has a direction and has an end, whether it's the coming of the millennium, the coming of the great socialist paradise or whatever, people who believe that history is unidirectional and linear are going to have a severe shock, because that is going to be reversed. Whether we measure it in terms of the years that will elapse in the rightward drift, which is going to offset the leftward drift of the last 60 years, whether we measure it in years or whether we measure it in achievements, that's to say when particular items of the left-wing agenda are reversed, is a big question. But there is a further possibility that it's not just going to be a question of a pendular shift from going to the left to going to the right. It's actually the reversal of a total historical aberration. Can you imagine a time in previous centuries when a potential prime minister would say that he didn't really know whether a woman had a penis or not, or what exactly constituted a woman? That he would be flustered and startled at the very question. That the future Chancellor of the Exchequer would have similar difficulties. We've all seen the pictures of Reeves stuttering her way through an interview on London LBC. This is the end point of a total aberration in Western civilization, which is unlikely, I hope, to be repeated. What's happening is we're reverting to the norm, what's been true of human politics, human culture for thousands of years. If you look outside the Western bubble, look at the Vladimir Putins, the Narendra Modis, the Xi Jinpings. They're just normality itself. They're strong leaders who have an iron rule over their peoples and who pursue rigidly nationalistic politics. Trump is simply the reversion to the norm in many respects, after decades of worrying about other people's futures. He's actually putting America first, which is what most of the world have always done and always will do, right down to the tribal and familial level. There's a sociological norm called amoral familism, which is I look after my family and the rest of the world can go to hell. That's been the downfall of many cultures in a sense. That's why Argentina never overtook the United States, as it was predicted to do around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Because basically Argentina was populated by a lot of amoral families from the Mediterranean who couldn't think beyond lining their own pockets at the level of the family. That's where you got a Leopold Galtieri in charge rather than a deep thinker, a drunken oaf who thought it was a good idea to invade the Falklands and provoke Margaret Thatcher into winning them back, which brought the whole regime down. A lot of the world is governed by people like that, basically big peasants with peasant minds who see no further. We live in a world of enemies, and that's what Trump is trying to drive home, that Europe has to start thinking about itself, not in terms of what good we can do for the rest of the world. The rest of the world will lap up whatever we choose to throw at it, and then come back and hate us. There's an enormous majority in the United Nations of ex-colonial governed countries who simply hate the West and can't wait to see it crumble. So why are we busy feeding them our resources rather than defending ourselves? It makes no sense. Anyway, that era is coming to a halt. What is going to happen in British politics? Well, you can see already that some of the more intelligent members of the left are worldwide have seen the writing on the wall. Jacinda Ardern was the first to realise it was better to leap out of the window rather than be pushed out of it in a humiliating defeat electorally. Nicola Sturgeon went the same way. You've got Trudeau. Justin Trudeau has seen the writing on the wall and resigned in time. Even Leo Varadkar in Ireland. All these people saw that the game was up and got out in good time. Across the continent, you've got Rassemblement National, AFD, Freedom Party, Wilders Party in Netherlands, succeeding in local elections, becoming in some cases the biggest party, but still isolated from power because the rest of the parties will form a cabal against them and lock them out. But that cannot go on forever. That is basically solving the problem of the water flowing over the dike by sticking your finger in every hole. Eventually you run out of fingers. Eventually they will have to compromise, and usually it'll be the centre-right, one assumes, something like the Christian Democrats, who will form an alliance with the insurgent radical nationalists. Now, in this whole bubble, we are the one exception. Starmer is the exception to the rule because we were out of sync with the rest of Europe, and it was, if you like, a Christian Democrat or Tory majority which was destroyed because after 14 years of doing nothing, despite Bojo's win, in which they had the ability, with an 80-seat majority, to do what they wanted to do and claimed they were going to do. They promised us they would stop immigration. They did nothing of the sort. Wokery, where did that come from? It hasn't arisen during 6 or 8 months of Labour rule. It was deeply embedded under the Tories. They claim now that they're against wokeism. They didn't stop it then. In fact, they encouraged it. All these rules about white people need not apply to the RAF, etc., they came in under the Tories. Starmer is beginning to wake up, and that's why he's changing his priorities. But most sensible money is now on reform, destroying the duopoly. So the next question I want to address is, what should our attitude be to reform? Well, Lawrence and Steve, but principally Lawrence, have already said what our attitude is to them. We are genuine nationalists, they're fake nationalists. They're actually part of the same grouping as the Uni Party. This will become apparent, which is why we must play the long term. As a number of speakers have said, we're not in this for rapid victories. We don't expect that we could rise to power. But even if we did, we've got a further problem that the whole civil service, police, judiciary, every institution in government is now filled with people who took the long march through the institutions that the Marxists preached back in the 50s. Even if a nationalist government were to come to power, it would not be able to achieve its aims rapidly or possibly at all, as long as what Michael Gove called the blob dominates teaching, the civil service, the police and the courts. It could take a generation to change them. It was an old joke in Italian politics that each government inherited the judges and the policemen of the previous regime. So Mussolini inherited a liberal judiciary and police force. The Christian Democrats of the 50s inherited Mussolini's judges and police force, etc., etc. They're always out of sync because the people that are supposed to enforce the legislation you pass in the House of Commons are people from a previous generation who are likely to be opposed to it. So we saw that with Brexit. Every attempt was made by the civil service and the usual suspects in the Tory and Labour parties to prevent any good coming out of Brexit. Starmer is now in the paradoxical situation that he's benefiting from Brexit and that he can act as a middleman between America and the EU. Had he stayed in the EU, as he wanted, he would simply be one of 27 leaders, presumably taking orders from Ursula von der Leyen. He would have no independent power to negotiate on behalf of an independent Britain. He would just be part of the EU gang. And we all know how cowardly and feeble and incompetent most of the leaders of EU countries are. They've risen to the top largely by Buggins' turns, by being inoffensive placemen who do as they're told. So what we can predict is that at some stage reform will do one good thing, which is to destroy the duopoly. It will shunt Labour and Tories into history. My prediction will be that in 10 years' time it will be a revived Liberal Party without class associations like Labour does, without ethnic associations like Labour does with the problematic Muslim voters, Liberals versus Reform. But what we can be sure of is even if Reform achieves government, it will fail. And that's where we come in, because in the long run we're going to be, as Harold Macmillan said of the Americans, we're going to be the Greeks in their Roman Empire. We're going to be the Trotskyists in their Stalinist USSR. We're going to be the people that say, no, we're holding out for principles, not just power. We don't just want power for its own sake or so that we can have a comfortable lifestyle. We're willing to make sacrifices to achieve our principles' goals. And that's a long-term game, because we have to wait for both Reform to dispose of the cabal of politicians that's in charge at the moment, Labour and Tory, to dispose of them, and then to fail itself. And it will fail for both internal and external reasons. Now, Lawrence has already pointed out that they are not true nationalists. In one critical sense, they don't conceive of a nation in the first place. If you listen to Farage speak, he speaks about the economy. It's just like Gordon Brown or Blair. He's saying the economy needs more workers. Well, it doesn't, but that's not the point. The point is not to think in terms of the people, the folk, the nation at all, but to think of Britain as basically a giant factory which needs workers or can lay off workers as it chooses and gets the cheapest labour available from the world market, or outsources production to a cheap third world country that will make our goods cheaper, but at the expense of laying off a lot of our workers, so it's not cheaper at all because we're paying their unemployment benefit and watching our cities crumble. So we expect Reform to fail because it's got internal contradictions. It pretends that it's there for the ordinary Brit, the ordinary working man. Farage in the pub with his pint and his fag, pretending, like Harold Wilson, to be a working man when everybody knew that Harold Wilson was an Oxford graduate who went home to a bottle of 25-year-old brandy and a fine meal while he pretended that a bottle of HB sauce was on his table. It's the same old game, pretending to be one of the lads. David Cameron with his open-neck shirt, call me Dave, all that game. Farage is playing that same game, but he's at the end of the day a city trader. And the rest of his, the group of people that previously owned Reform as a PLC, like Richard Tice, they're no different, they're millionaires. Even Ben Habib, one of the better ones, a millionaire. How can they represent ordinary working people? And as for the organisation of the Reform Party, it's trying to pretend to be democratically organised, but we haven't seen any elections yet. Can anybody imagine of Reform actually sacking Farage, even if he fails? But as I say, that is not the central problem. The central problem is, if you look at the four root metaphors that the Californian philosopher Steve Pepper identified, they are mechanistic. They believe that society, and they use the word society rather than nation or people or folk, that society can be engineered till it's right. That's a sort of Stalinist conception. That's seeing society as a lot of plastic or a lot of metal like Lego that you can mould into shape or fix together. It doesn't conceive of a people as having some sort of organic coherence inherited from centuries of tradition, of a common language, of common culture, of ways of doing things that are unique to that culture. They don't conceive that at all. It doesn't enter into their calculations. They think purely in economic terms, not in the terms that we think of, that we should be asking the question, what is good for the British people? Not what is good for the British economy. The answers will be quite different. We don't see Britain as one great big factory and the aim to make a profit. The aim is to produce enough goods to satisfy most people's needs so that most people have a reasonable standard of living. And in another place, we will address the issue that we should go back to contribution-based benefits and things like place on the housing queue instead of need, which always rewards the recent arrival who hasn't paid into the system more than those who have paid into it all their lives and yet go to the back of the queue. But as I say, that the problem for both Reform and anybody else who wants to change the system is the inertia of the civil service, the police, the courts, which are all outside democratic control. Now, in the long term, we can do something by introducing direct democracy. When you talk about that, people say, oh, you mustn't politicise the police. Well, they're politicised now, but not in a form which people control. They're controlled by whatever's laid down at the College of Policing at Hendon, and has become the new norm, so that non-crime hate incidents are ranked above burglary or robbery or even extreme violence, like Labour MPs punching one of their constituents to the ground and then carrying on punching them. They will get a suspended sentence. We all know what would happen if we did the same. We'd go to jail for a very long time. We might even just have to do a tweet during the time of the riots in July after the Southport massacre, and we would get extremely stiff sentences, because we all know we live in a two-tier universe at every level, and we have no control over it. It's something that's been imposed on us. It's not something that anybody ever voted for. So that's going to take a long time to change. You have a generation of kids, Gen Z so-called, or Gen Z, if you prefer it, who believe that Britain is such a rotten place that only 1 in 10 would fight for it. It's going to take a long time to change that. We can't do very much from the outside looking in. One solution, paradoxically, for nationalists might be to privatise a lot of it, because capitalism is driven by one aim, which is to make money. You could hire a security firm that could do the job of much of the local policing, because it will do what it's told to earn its contract wage. If you employed G4S or somebody to do the job of local policing, they would quite simply respond to the fact, do as you're told, or we'll find another person, another firm that will do the job better. They will respond to the lure of money. Look what's happening to the big corporations in the States. As Vivek Ramaswamy pointed out the other day, these people invested in diversity, equity and inclusiveness because it's a cheap way of looking good. He gives an example of a chemical factory near Lake Michigan or something like that, which was systematically polluting the environment and killing people with cancer. What did they do? They put on a big show of being fond of transgender people, big DEI program, ostentatiously doing the right thing, like Ben and Jerry's and so on, backing the right causes. It cost that corporation peanuts. Actually addressing the issue of cleaning up the environment and stopping polluting the lake and killing people would have cost a lot more. So DEI was never anything other than smoke and mirrors. It was just a smokescreen to conceal corporate greed. That is why corporations will respond to a strong touch. Trump has made it very plain he has no time for DEI. All these big name corporations have turned around just like that and said, yep, whatever you want, boss, you're the one that pays the money. We know which way the wind's blowing. We can drop DEI just like that. Look at what Musk is doing, uncovering all sorts of waste and corruption and simply holding it up to public view. That's why simply being an anti-immigration party isn't enough. We must argue for free speech, transparency, and direct democracy, an actual popular grip on things. If that means we elect our local district attorney or our local police chief, well, it works to a certain extent in the States, but at least the politics is out in the open. It's not being decided behind your backs behind closed doors. It is something we have control over. We can vote for a tough police officer, or we can vote for a weak police officer, but at least we've got some say in the matter. These decisions aren't made in institutions beyond our control. That's one possibility. The long-term ones are obviously we have to rewrite the history books so that Britain is no longer the bad guy for centuries introducing slavery. Twice as many slaves were exported to the Americas by the Portuguese, but they're not beating themselves up. For every slave sent across the Atlantic to the Americas, another slave was sent to the Muslim world. That went back further and is still going on today, that slaves are common in the Muslim world. Why? Because the Quran does not condemn slavery. Christianity did. William Wilberforce and people were motivated by Christian ideals. British society has become what it was in the 1950s, the last good point that I can remember, because it was deeply infused with Christianity. And notice that J.D. Vance made a big point of the fact that a society without some sort of moral compass is not going anywhere. The aim to make money is not the same as making America great. He's spoken out for the need for values. And that was what struck a chord with people all over the world. When they saw J.D. Vance speaking the other day, he was speaking about values that rose above that of simply making America wealthy. He was talking about making America great, which is not the same thing at all. He was defending traditional family values, love of country, God, etc. He was not simply saying we want to make America the wealthiest city on the wealthiest country on earth. He could do that, and it would still be hollow at the core. Our aim is to do a similar thing for Britain. We have to, in that case, improve the economy, because we all know that at the moment it is failing. One of the ways of doing that is obviously to take off the burden of DEI and equity and the rest of it, and to get rid of the net zero nonsense. But one suspects that Starmer is already coming to that conclusion. We'll get rid of Miliband because we simply can't afford it. But if we're going to find money for a revised defence policy, if we're going to actually have the weapons and the training to defend ourselves, then we're going to have to make the economy work harder. And one of the solutions to that is quite simply the fact that millions of Brits do not want to work at all. So we have to take a tough line on things like disability and mental health issues, which are largely a way of concealing laziness. So we have to address some issues which people don't want to see addressed, like getting the economy going by getting people to work harder, not work from home, turn up at the office, put in the full hours and the rest of it. That is going to take a generation to reverse, because particularly during COVID, people were encouraged to give up work, in effect. They were actually paid to stay at home by Rishi Sunak, and we're still paying the burden of that, and our children will be paying the burden of that. The cost of loan repayments is now roughly equal to the defence budget. That cannot go on. We cannot borrow our way out of difficulty. So the only way to generate growth is to take a lot of the burdens of industry, which Rachel Reeves is putting on her. And that, unfortunately, is going to be a long, hard struggle. But if it's a struggle which Reform are going to have to do for us, in effect, our job is to be waiting in the wings so that when they fail, and they will fail because a lot of these problems are either insoluble or will take generations of work to do, we can come forward and actually criticise Reform not from the right but from the left, because we will be sticking up for the ordinary working people who are still under a Reform government going to be paying an impossible burden, because at the end of the day the Farages and the Tices and the rest of them are not really interested in working people. And they don't even see them as a people, they see them as a workforce. And that is the difference between us and them. We see them primarily as British people who are our kith and kin, and we want to help achieve a better life. But we can only do that in an ethnically homogenous, high-trust society in which people will work that extra hour, will go that extra mile, because they're working for what is essentially a giant family. That is what a nation is. It's a giant family, and you feel obligations to your family that you do not feel to strangers. And a society consisting of one in, one out strangers is no substitute for a proper nation. That is why we are true nationalists.
You know, I think we are lucky as a party to have such a fantastic speaker, a highly intelligent man in the form of our chairman, Jim Lewthwaite.